Welcome to the Real Life Overtime Podcast, the place where the members of the Real Life Ministries sermon team go deeper into the weekend sermon. Watch them as they unpack, unfold, and unravel the weekend sermon like never before. So fasten your seatbelts, hit play, and join us for Real Life Overtime, where every episode is an adventure and this sermon doesn't end on Sunday.
Hello, Real Life Ministries. Welcome to the Overtime Podcast. And we've been walking through the Sermon on the Mount. The series is called Paradox. And this last couple of weeks, I've been away on vacation, and we've had the opportunity to have some of these great guys we have here preaching. And actually, Chris Short spoke here, and but he's unable to be here this morning, so I'm kind of going to act as the host, but just hearing what was preached, awesome. We've been looking at really the kingdom of heaven sort of aspect of all of this, and it starts out, blessed are the poor in spirit, and there's this sort of tenor of humility that goes all the way through the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes. And it takes humility to be in the kingdom of heaven, because the only way you can be in is if you're willing to serve the king. It takes humility to be in the kingdom of heaven, because the only way you get in is if you allow God to save you. Mm. And so as you walk through all of these things, we get to this passage that talks about the merciful. Blessed are the merciful. And I as I was listening to you guys speak this last weekend, unpacking this mercy aspect to the kingdom is so important. Why don't you guys kind of just give a little bit of a summation of what you guys really unpacked in your different places? And so Blake, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, great. Like you mentioned, we worked a little bit of the continuation of the Beatitudes working through. Talked about how a few weeks ago meekness was a setup for merciful. They're similar but different. Mercy defined using some of the language, talking about how it's a choice to not really execute an ability when somebody is in a position that warrants consequences or judgment. And so it's a merciful act, which is different than a meek act. But we started there, talked a little bit about how God gives us a parable. One of the main verses we talked about is the concept of the unmerciful servant, in which Jesus tells a story about a master that is merciful towards someone that owes a debt, in hopes that mercy would carry on to an individual's life. And then through the story, we see that doesn't happen, and that the result of that would be looked down upon, makes God angry. Even though he's slow to anger, he's still righteous and just. And so we kicked around that idea of what are the things that cause us to not be merciful, excuses or fear, or one of the personal things that I had shared is I struggle to not being taken advantage of with mercy. And even in that story, I talked about how it's the best and most motivating factor to be merciful is in hopes that people will receive it and be changed. But the greatest excuses that I make for myself is they're going to take advantage of the mercy, and continue to be the same. And so there was a paradox even within that story that we talked about that was fun. And then we talked a little bit, and Bill, you and I were talking about this before, just the concept of the mercy seat of God and how he sets up the ability to cover us with his mercy, which allows us to move towards reconciliation and redemption. So we camped there a little bit.
Yeah, you're talking about, okay, you've got the Ten Commandments, the law, the Levitical law, and you have the tabernacle, you have the Holy of Holies, the different aspects of this, which is a replica of the real one in heaven, Book of Hebrews tells us. You've got inside of the Ark of the Covenant, you have the Ten Commandments, you have the staff, you have these different kinds of things that God placed in that. And then over the top is the mercy seat. And so, Bill, I know you really went into that. Explain that whole mercy seat more.
Jumping off what Blake said, though, and again, this isn't, hardcore doctrine, but it is interesting that when Mary came to the tomb, and she looked in. John gives us a little hint that seems like it's a picture of the mercy seat on the Ark of the Covenant.
Explain what the mercy seat looks like.
Well, the mercy seat was a solid gold lid to the box, the ark, and then two solid gold angels, cherubim, with their wings forward, it says, and then right there was the mercy seat. That's the place that every year, annually, the high priest, after making sacrifice, atonement for his sin and the nation's sin, he sprinkled the blood of that lamb on the mercy seat. So God met the people there, in essence, to bestow mercy, or a merciful act that he would even come down and meet with them.
Over the top of the law.
Over the top of the
as
law.
As a visual picture.
Yeah, right.
But then what you're saying is when Christ is...
well, it's just interesting, the picture, when she looks in the tomb, there's a cherub and a cherub, two angels, one at the head and one at the foot of where Jesus was laying, and his blood obviously was still on the... on the
shroud.
tab where that's, and I don't know, you don't make a big deal out of that, but just interesting. Two angels, that's where God met us, and his mercy was bestowed on us through him being a merciful sacrifice, for him relating to us and taking on human form. That's just primo mercy.
Yeah, which again, if there's humility, we're constantly reminded that we've been shown mercy.
Yeah.
And to your point, Blake, when you're talking about the unmerciful servant, the parable Jesus told, he'd been forgiven far more than what he was owed.
Right.
But it didn't translate into how he treated those others. And in the kingdom of heaven, there's this picture of we've all broken the law. The reason we're in the kingdom of at all is because of his mercy. And that love for God, that, first the love of God to us and the mercy to us we were supposed to receive it. And as a characteristic, a few weeks ago, you preached on some of the characteristics of a small community. You drive in a small community.
The customs,
the custom was,
Everybody
how you
waves,
doing?
yeah.
Everybody waves, right? One of the customs of the kingdom of heaven is this humility that we've received mercy, and therefore that's a custom that we give each other. And as we come to communion, as we look at baptism, as we look at what Jesus did, there's this reinforcement of, we've received something, therefore it flows from us to others. Wayne, you spoke at Hayden this last week.
Yep.
Tell me about what that was like. Where did you go?
Yeah, actually, you just set up exactly where we went. With mercy, we've got to remind ourselves of how merciful God was and continues to be with each of us, so that we can display and give mercy to those that we're in relationship with that may have hurt us or may have taken advantage of us, but also to those who have not surrendered their hearts to Jesus. And we took this approach of how many of us like to see justice served? And I think every hand went up. And then it was like, okay, individually, do you lean on the side of justice or do you lean on the side of mercy? And there was a tension there, right? Because it's like, well, man, if I say I'm justice, then that means I'm not merciful. And if I say that I can lean on mercy, that means don't stand for justice. And the irony of it, or the paradox of it, is God is both. God is both full of justice and mercy. And we see that with Jesus, his son, as he was displayed on the cross. And so for us to really understand, and for me, even as I was going through this and knowing I was preparing for this message, I am such a justice guy. I am all about justice. And people, it's like, you made your bed, you got to lay in it. It's not the spirit of the law, it's the letter of the law. And I want to see justice served. And what I realized in this for myself is it's very easy for me to become a judge of other sin, but a great attorney for my own sin.
Yeah.
Right?
That's really good. A great judge, not the prosecuting attorney, the defense attorney, right? So I am the prosecutor for other people, or the judge himself.
The judge himself.
And I am the defense attorney
for myself and
for
my own
myself.
actions.
That's really terrible because I do that too. That really hammers you, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you have? Is that the story you wanted to from this last week?
Yeah, I'll tell you the story that was just really shook me was we were talking about forgiveness. And at the end of the second service, I had a guy come up to me and he said, man, he said, thank you for this message. He says, I'm such a justice guy. He said, this 4th of July, my parents' house burned down. And he said, I went yesterday, which was Saturday, to go and help them recover stuff in their loss. And the neighbors who had the Roman candle fight, which lit his dad's house on fire, came over. And he was like, Dad, I'm going to handle this. And he was ready to make this guy pay for what he had done. He said, son, I want to handle it the way that God would. And he went over and he forgave the guy. And the guy says, why would you forgive me? I've just destroyed, with our actions, we just destroyed your home and your memories and all that you had. And he says, because I've been forgiven much. And the guy goes on to show me the picture of his dad leading his neighbor to Christ. And it's like, you can't have a better bookend to this sermon from yesterday and the mercy and forgiveness that was displayed in the life of the neighbor. And I was like, man, I really would have loved to known that on the 4th of July. You know what I mean? I really would have loved to be a part of that. And then shortly after I had shared that third service, one of the firefighters came up to me. He says, hey, I don't know if you know this or not, but I was on scene. And he said the only thing that guy wanted from his house was his Bible. And he said, and shortly before the roof collapsed, I was able to hand this man his Bible. And I just thought, man, what a picture of God's mercy. Not only for this family, but for the neighbor who was led to Christ because of the events that took place.
Wow. Yeah, that's powerful.
Yeah.
And I think that whole concept of wanting justice, wanting to have a country where laws are given and followed, unless it was maybe our son. Right. And again, we're not saying there shouldn't be justice. There has to be justice. Yep. And God is just, right? I think the picture of the law given is for our own good. It's binding. You don't have a society without it. The picture of God that I see in Scripture is He gave the law. Rejected the law. Then He showed overwhelming mercy to those who would receive it, right? Yep. And now He's like, I have prepared for you, I've given for you a sacrifice that cost me. It's not blood of goats or animals. It was His own Son, the highest value. So he's actually not saying, hey, sin goes away. We'll just act like it didn't exist. No, it absolutely exists. It absolutely has to be paid. It is paid. It's just not being paid by us. So the requirement of the law is fulfilled in Christ Jesus, who is fully valuable enough to pay for all of our sin. The penalty, He paid for it in full. And God offers us a pardon, so to speak. Actually, pardon's not really the right word, because pardon says that you don't have to pay for it. In this case, it was fully paid by someone else. And then He says, now this is who I fully am: righteous, merciful. Because we're free will human beings, we're made in His image, we have the ability to choose. We get to choose to reject His mercy. But we don't get the ability to reject His justice. So in my mind, what that means is He's just. He's merciful. You can say no to His mercy. But that means then you have to deal with His justice, His holiness, His righteousness.
Yeah, you're going to pay the price, not Jesus.
Yeah. You get to pay you did it. You chose to do it. Now you get to pay. You get to decide who pays for it. But the price is the price. Yep. Right? And I
think when you say rejects our mercy too, I think that probably for most of us, we are rejecting His mercy by minimizing our sin. It's not a big deal, or it's not that bad, or I'm not that bad, or God is too harsh, or whatever, And so we reject His mercy a lot of times, I think, by minimizing our sin.
How does comparison fit into that?
You mean, well, that's a good one that you bring up. You know, Jesus tells the story of the two guys that were praying, and the one was this religious leader, Pharisee, and he apparently stands up and boldly says it for everybody to hear. You know, I thank God that I'm not like that tax gatherer over there, and I'm so righteous and holy and in good standing with you. And then the tax gatherer who was over there that he just humiliated has his head down. He's kind of off in the corner, and he just says, "Be merciful to me, a sinner." And Jesus asked for me, he says, "Which one of those two do you think went away justified?"
Right.
Well, it was the guy who
that's what Chris
mercy.
preached on that here, is that we can always find, this is what Chris said, and I totally agree, we can find somebody who has a sin that we don't do, that we're not tempted with, and make that sin worse than our own.
Right.
And, you know, James said it very clearly. If you don't break that part of the law, but you break that part of the law, you've broken the law.
Yeah.
And when we compare ourselves to somebody else, we're completely missing the point, because when we stand before the Lord, it's not going to be, those other people aren't going to be there.
Yeah,
but hey, I'm like, no, you're going to stand before the Lord. And I think, Isaiah 6 is a great passage where, you've got Isaiah, who's a prophet and a holy man of Israel.
But once he's in the presence of God, he becomes aware of the true standard.
Yeah.
And he says, "I'm a dead man.
Yeah.
Exactly. There's no way out of this thing." Yeah.
He sees God.
Yeah.
And he doesn't go, but he's like, I'm completely undone. It actually, in the Hebrew there, I'm undone. I am a man of unclean lips, and I'm from a people. He starts, I swim in this lake, but I contribute to this lake of filth and dirtiness. And he just falls down on his face. And that's going to be the picture of what it looks like in facing God on Judgment Day.
I had a question that was asked of me over at our campus. I thought was really good. Wondering the difference between showing mercy, or even, I think it's Matthew 18 is the beginning of that parable, to where Jesus says, "How many times do I forgive?" Right? He's asked that question, and they say 7 times, and he says, "I say 77 times," which appears to be unending. What's the difference between unending mercy, which is kind of like, I'm never going to do anything about it, and this idea of enabling or allowing people to continue to sin, hurt themselves, hurt relationships?
Because you worry about people that are going to take advantage of this.
That's a good question that I would love for you just to answer, Bill. But I thought that was good for us to maybe kick around practical application. Love your thoughts on that. What's the difference between those two things?
Well, let me ask you this question. What's the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation?
That's good. What do you think, BK?
Well, forgiveness is, I am willingly motivated by whatever. We hope it's by God's grace. I will not hold this against you. It's over. It's done. Reconciliation is, and now together, can't just all be me. We come back, we deal with the business at hand, and we move on in relationship. May not be the same kind of relationship. Things might be different. Sometimes sin leaves some pretty deep scars. But we will not be enemies. We will not be at odds. That's reconciliation. And they're different things, but they're related, because you can't have reconciliation without forgiveness.
Yeah.
But forgiveness might take a different, reconciliation might take a different form, but forgiveness is...
Let's use a terrible example. I don't mean it's a bad example. I mean it's something terrible. You have a child who grows up in an abusive home. And you guys have heard me say this. I stole it from somewhere, I don't remember where, and you guys probably have the same similar sort of example, but a lack of forgiveness is like a poison you drink yourself, hoping it will kill somebody else. A lack of forgiveness creates bitterness in your own heart. It poisons your own well. Forgiveness is to give over to God the right to make that judgment. Your debt to me is paid. I mean, it's over. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm going to continue in a relationship. Forgiveness is something I can give somebody who hasn't even asked for forgiveness for my own good. I give it to God. Reconciliation, in my view, is to say, we're going to go back to a relationship, and I'm going to trust you. To have deep relationship means trust. Yeah. And if they're untrustworthy, even if they were untrustworthy in the past, it doesn't mean I have to go back to the same relationship, in my view, as it was before. Maybe they're untrustworthy. Maybe they've never said they were sorry. Maybe they've said they're sorry, but they still don't get it. I don't have to go back. And I'll give you an example of, for a kid who's been through abuse, the dad wants to say, I'm sorry, but he really wants relationship. You don't really know whether he's sorry or not, and you don't even know whether he's trustworthy or not. I can forgive that, give that to God, but the boundaries are going to be there based on trust, based on earning back trust. Trust doesn't have to be given.
Right.
Would you?
I'd use a different word, but I think trust is right. Access is going to be different.
Yeah.
Your access in our relationship is going to be different.
Yeah.
I'm not going to try and do things to punish you or thwart you because I've forgiven you, but your access is going to be different.
Yeah.
As trust is rebuilt.
Yeah.
And it might never be, in some cases people have things done to them that level of access will not be, at least this side of heaven, not be available again. Doesn't mean I'm going to be bitter toward you, but access is going to be limited.
Well, and sometimes I can forgive you. When my son first came out of addiction, I can forgive you, but that doesn't mean I'm going to allow you to come back into our home and have access to your brothers, to me, to everybody else, until there's trust that has been built back, so that the other people in the family are safe. There's a level of safety I'm responsible for those. I can't love you so much that I give you whatever you need at the expense of all the other people in the group. So that's why getting wisdom on what this looks like from others outside. Sometimes you can't see the forest for the trees. You think forgiveness is, and people will use that. You're supposed to forgive me.
Well, I'm glad you said that, Jim, because I think that kind of addresses what the question that Blake got to, though, is we talked about an instance where a guy went through a real difficult situation, in his marriage. And Christian, I'm sure well-intending Christian people couldn't wait to rush in and say, well, you got to forgive him, because, it says if you don't forgive. And that was the wrong thing to say to him at that time. He had to start clear back with love and move to mercy before he could even get to forgiveness. And so I likened it to when I used to wrestle with my brothers, and I wouldn't quit, but they were bigger than me, and they'd twist my arm around my back and make me cry mercy. And that's how I defined mercy for years. And sometimes that's how Christians define mercy. You have to do this. Yeah. That's not mercy. God didn't have to.
Yeah.
His mercies are new every morning. He never gets worn out. That's amazing to me. But when we're thinking obligatory mercy, that can be damaging. That's not healthy for people. And everybody's process is different. Everybody takes time.
Well, for me, I believe in the death penalty. You take a life. There has to be a law for the culture as a protection to the culture. Now, somebody might say, well, if they said they were sorry and they're truly repentant, then you shouldn't take them to the death penalty. And I would say, no, the death penalty is a death penalty. That's my view. And I know that can be somewhat controversial, but the Old Testament talks about the payment for certain specific sins, right? And there's a cost to it. Now, what I do believe is that because somebody's on death row and they deserve it, they're guilty, that doesn't mean they can't be saved. That doesn't mean, as far as eternity is concerned, there is a salvation from this world down here as we see it. But there is a law that has to be for the good of all of the people. And so, again, you get faulty courts somebody gets convicted of something they didn't actually do, and there's all those considerations into it. But in my view, again, there's a penalty to be paid, and a truly repentant person says, I'm willing to pay. I'm willing to do what I'm asked to do because I broke the law. That tells me, like, so my kid, growing up, I don't know if you guys had this happen, but they did something wrong. And I said, okay, now you have curfew, and now you're grounded, and now you don't get the car. And then they'd say, but I said I was sorry.
Right.
I said I was sorry. Well, no, if you're sorry, then you accept the penalty for what you did. And you're like, okay, that was the rule. That's what. Now again, if I change the penalty, then what I'm doing is I'm breaking my word. I'm now saying that the penalty wasn't actually the just penalty for that to begin with, and I don't keep it anyway. Whereas Christianity is, God did keep the penalty. The penalty was death. Jesus died. He didn't bypass it and say, oh, no, somebody paid. And it was Christ, and he pays it or you pay it. But when you're talking about forgiveness, there's a lot of nuance to this. Yeah. The question I would say is there a spirit of mercy in you that you're reflecting on your own life? You're reflecting on a merciful attitude if somebody's in a death row and they killed your brother. Is, I want you to know that I forgive you. Can I pray with you to accept Jesus? Can I pray with you to accept? I want you to know Jesus. I don't hate you. Right? That's a merciful attitude, though you might go, the penalty was this. This is the law. This is the payment for the law. I want you to endure that, but I also, because I've received mercy, I may not have done what you did. I did other things. I need, and there's a heart of mercy that is extended because that's the heart of God. And as you become more Christ-like, we're being conformed to the likeness of Christ. How can we say that we are Christians if we're not being filled by the fruit of the Spirit in our life? Love is an act of the will to give a person what they need rather than what they deserve. Mercy, as we talked about, is this I'm not going to give you what you deserve, but grace is to give you something you don't deserve, which is a different aspect of this. So these are all questions, but the question I would just say is there growing mercy in you as you understand the humility that we all should be faced with and acknowledging as we become Christ followers?
Yeah. It's good. A couple of things I heard is just helpful is forgiveness is different than reconciliation. Right. You can forgive. That doesn't always mean reconciliation. Every situation is unique, right? There's nuance to it and the relationship and the history. And so there's not always a pat answer every time, which always lends itself to what I think we talk about, to be in relationship and get wise counsel and help process through things, I think is wise. I heard you both say, which I thought was really good in the context, that just because you can acknowledge a situation mercifully doesn't mean that you throw right and wrong out the window, that you don't operate with wisdom or boundaries, right? That you don't automatically go back to a clean slate every time in actions and access and what the relationship looks like. And so acknowledging that somebody's wrong and still being able to give mercy is appropriate for the situation. And then we got to work through, what does that mean then? One thing I would add to it, I know we had briefly mentioned before as we end here, is there's my part and God's part, and then there's another person's part. Right. My part is to work through being gracious and showing mercy and doing that appropriately. God is the one that's going to bring justice in his timing, in his way. And then there's the other person's part to hear that or not, to move towards a position of repentance or habitual repeated sin, which, depending on their response, leads to our next step in action.
Right.
And it's not always the same. So it's kind of a choose thing as we go, but those are helpful pieces to go, all right, at least with some tools, we can have that conversation.
And I think if they want to, I don't know, maybe this isn't helpful, but I think if they want a text for that, Romans 12, 1 and 2, I just think it's interesting. He says, because he's getting ready for the big ask. And the big ask is, you're going to be a living sacrifice. In other words, you're going to actually crawl up willfully, volitionally, you're going to crawl up on the altar and sacrifice your body for the service of the Lord. But he
As
starts
a living sacrifice.
A living sacrifice. Yeah, you're going to sacrifice. Yeah, living
as
sacrifice.
you live. Yeah.
But you're going to do it willingly. But he starts it by saying, I urge you, therefore, in view of the mercies of God. I can't get on that altar if I don't start by reciting and rehearsing and remembering the mercy of God in my life.
That's good.
I'm not getting on that. I'm not even going to try to forgive. But when I look at the mercy of God, and he starts out, he says, in view of the mercies of God. That'd be a good verse for someone who's wrestling with that. Oh, that would be me to review.
That's good.
Yeah, I think even taking the log out of your own eye before you look at the speck of your brother's, he says, first take the log out of your own eye. In other words, reflect on your stuff, what you're standing before the Lord, who you are. And once you do that, what that does for me is it puts down pride, it puts down anger, resentment, bitterness, because I'm reflecting on what God's done for me. Now I can think clearly about what should the boundaries be. What does it look like? To not react in anger or fear or whatever, but now I'm going to think through what is the proper way to handle this hurt, this pain, this somebody hurt me or wronged me. And remembering that God wants me to give mercy. Blessed are the merciful. Again, though, even God's mercy has boundaries, right? His mercy is to allow us to keep living until we die or Jesus returns. His mercy ends at that point. Now it's judgment. Now is the time of salvation. Now is the time that we can accept Christ, right? But there's an end to where that mercy is over, right? And so what does it look like to go, there are boundaries on this? And again, going back to that passage you're talking about, how many times Peter said, my brother sins against me, and then comes and asks forgiveness, and I forgive him. How many times should I do that? 7? Because, the Hebrew number of 7 is completion, perfection. And Jesus said, no, 70 times 7. And again, though, he wasn't saying there isn't any boundaries to what somebody who is truly repented looks like. Jesus didn't give the same access to everybody forever. There are boundaries. So, but again, when I'm hurt or angry or resentful or thinking through what that looks like, I got to go to the Lord first. I got to think through that. What has he given me? I got to plug into that source of wisdom and abiding so that I can, sometimes that's wise counsel. How should I handle this? I can't see the forest for trees. I'm filled with hurt or anger, bitterness. All right, how do I work through that so that I'm abiding in Christ and the fruit of the Spirit is coming out of me? And by the way, love does not rejoice with unrighteousness. So love isn't just affirming everything you do or letting you get away with whatever. No, there are boundaries. And what does that look like? And helping people walk through that. Anything you want to close with, Wayne?
Just a reminder for me is that Micah 6:8 passage where it says, and what does the Lord want you to do? It's to act, to seek justice, love mercy.
To love mercy.
Love mercy and walk humbly with our God. And I think the only way we can do that is walking humbly with our God. Because if not, I'm going to seek my own justice. Right. And I'm not going to want to naturally forgive, but I just love that piece of it's walking humbly with our God. That actually enables us to do that.
It's kind of like what you said. I do love mercy.
Yeah.
For me.
For me. May not be good for you, but it's really good for
Mercy
me.
Me. It was all about them.
Yeah. I love the mercy he gives to me. It's just that constant reminder that our attitude towards sin in the world is different than the world's attitude towards sin in the world. The world's attitude is my sin's not as bad as yours, or my sin isn't sin at all, or sin deserves absolute destruction, or there is, is there even what is sin? No, there is righteousness. There is a standard of righteousness. Why did he give it? Because he loves us. It's for good for us and everybody else. There are boundaries. There are keys to relationship, and not everybody you should have relationship at the same level with. There are boundaries. But we got to think through that, and a characteristic of the kingdom is we give people mercy. Yep. And so as we close, anything else anybody want to say? All right. Well, next week we come into the Overtime podcast again, and the subject for next week is "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God." And this one is, boy, it's a tough one. It goes beyond surface. It goes to the deep motives of your heart and your will and why you do what you do. So this next one's going to be fun, and we'll see you next week at the Overtime podcast. God bless you this weekend.